All right. Sorry, Jenny. Please go ahead.
So I have been running the WSU Plant and Insect Diagnostic Lab for the last 22 years, and I know that's just a drop in the bucket to some of you. Fortunately, have great colleagues before then. And then truthfully, I'm a little bit of a, what do you call it? Probably shouldn't be here because the kind of fruit that I like is nice tart apples, any of the citrus, and then just about everything else. I'm always grateful somebody else likes it because my body and the rest of the fruits just don't really exist. So in some cases, it's okay because like when not brown orange, stink bug, when spotted wing Drosophila first got introduced into the area, and that was the horrible thing. We saw it pretty early on at the clinic. People were just, oh my gosh, our blueberries, our raspberries, etc. And I was always the one that said, well, you give me a choice between a nice plump blueberry and a nice plump Drosophila larva, and I would prefer to eat the Drosophila larva because those blueberries and I just don't get along. So, but anyway, just thought I probably can't tell you a whole lot with all your experiences with fruit production, but what I can do is kind of step back and just talk about diagnosis because that's my bread and butter. Those are the things that I do every day. We were discussing a bunch of different problems before this talk started, and one of the people was trying to get an apple or some sort of fruit identified, and somebody had suggested it might be a medlar, and that brought up one of my great memories of getting some fruit in the fruit mush actually in the mail, being relatively revolted, didn't want to even look at it, pull it out and look at it, and yet through some, through the plastic bag, through some judicious looking of the literature, online resources, I went from not a single clue other than I think it's in the apple fam or the Rosaceae family, like an apple, something like that, to learning that it was a medlar and learning that the bletted fruit that was actually in the bag was the part you would eat. So always something interesting and something we can learn. I just wanted to acknowledge America's First People. I'm here on the Coast Salish Puyallup tribe, and I know you're from all over the place. So just let's take a moment to think about the people who first tended this land and being really great to be part of the story and being part of taking care of the land today. And then for me with diagnosis, one of the things that I always have to remind myself is that asking the big question, what is wrong with this plant is our kind of our go-to question, or, what's happening, those kind of things. And yet it's such a very big open-ended question that when you have those big questions, you often not make it to the right answer. So I always tell people one of the first things with diagnosis is to frame your questions so that you have small little concrete chunks of information that you can easily answer. Not easily, sorry, that's not probably good. You can have a strategy in order to get to an answer for. So before the talk this morning, before your business meeting started, we were talking about fire blights. So, the question on this Asian pear here could be, what is wrong? You could ask, is it fire blight? Is it some sort of dieback or those kind of things? And so there's a lot of stuff that's going to go into trying to diagnose what's going on. Fire blight is a pretty serious bacterial problem. It is present in the state, but is really only found in central and eastern Washington, east of the Cascade Mountains, has not been a proven problem here in the west of the mountains. But with, changes in climate and everything, who knows how long that's going to hold up. So one of the things that often happens is that people will call you up and or me up, or they might talk to you about fruit, and they'll have this really specific question, and you will be like, getting like with the fire blight, I get a little nervous because it's pretty hard at certain times of the year to confirm one way or the other. But if instead I step back and say, okay, could this be, or could it be associated with a root problem, or, various other things, then I often will get the right answer. So far with fire blight, all of the questions that have come in, at least from the west side of the state, have always been something else. So if the roots are failing because of a phytophthora root rot, you're going to see a blighting of the canopy, some dieback of the branches, and the plant is simply reacting to that problem, and it reacts to two different things in quite the same way. So that's one of the first pieces of advice I always tell people is, frame the questions so that you have a good chance of being able to get at an answer. And then I'm also a firm believer that starting by kind of thinking about the problems and planning is a really good idea, and helps you spend more time growing the crop than solving problems. So for me, when somebody is putting in an orchard, or whatever plant situation is going on, I'm a firm believer in thinking about it first. So several years ago, up in our area, a lot of people were putting in cider orchards for apple cider, and I was like, it was in the prime of the apple maggot area, and I thought, they were more interested in the cider than the apple trees. And they were, just people kept coming in and saying things like, I'm going to grow organically. And I thought, oh my gosh, how are you going to get an apple without apple maggot in this high pressure area? And then it turned out that in this case, very few of the cider apples are that, but let me see, not very few, but cider apples tend to be less palatable to apple maggot than eating apples or baking apples and stuff like that. So it turned out in that case, I wouldn't have done what these people were doing out of ignorance. I would have said, oh, I don't think that's a great idea, but it turned out they got away with it. They got lucky because there was some attribute of the apple maggot infestation that I hadn't been aware of up until getting that kind of information. So, you need to think about what the plants you're trying to grow are, what the diseases they could have, what pests to be concerned about. And then really important is to decide, okay, what are you willing to do on these kind of things? How much work are you going to do and stuff like that, trying to, spend your diagnostic time wisely and to get to a very, accurate answer so that you can start to manage the problem pretty simply. So the first thing about any type of plant problem is, what is the plant problem? So this particular tree is in one of my neighbor's yards, and you can see here that it does not have a ton of leaves, but there is some sections that have nice leaves on it. And what is going on here is, of course, the fungal disease peach leaf curl. So when this particular sample first came in, I think they thought it was an apricot or something like that. And it turned out, whatever they thought it was didn't get peach leaf curl. So I'm like, well, you've got peach leaf curl. So that tells me you've probably got a peach. And then, they went back into the records, and it turned out that it was a frost peach, which is supposed to be fairly resistant to peach leaf curl. But what's going on here is that, the tree is still pretty young. The environment is very, very conducive to the problem. And so in this particular tree this year, there was a lot of disease. And you can see where the leaves and stems were protected by the eaves. It would be drier up there. So the peach leaf curl pathogen couldn't get going. And then one of the other key features that we need to remember is when we see a problem, we also need to investigate if that's the time to manage it. And with peach leaf curl, when you see the problem, you're too late for that year. You need to wait till the next year to manage it, because the peach leaf curl pathogen did not infect the leaves at this stage. It infected them as the buds were forming. So that in our area, our management options for peach leaf curl, if you're going to do anything in the chemical world, are back in winter as the bud is forming. You need to protect it from the pathogen. And so there's important to know, what plant it is, where it's growing, and that will help you, try to decide if you're going to have problems and what you need to do about them. So truthfully, in this picture, the person has done everything pretty much the way they should have to manage a peach leaf curl issue. They've picked the right type of peach for the area. They have pruned for good air circulation, although of course it's right against the building there. etc. It just happened that, the tree is still young, and the environment for this particular spring a couple of years ago was highly conducive to that disease. So the owner of the tree has moved on. I need to meet the new neighbors this spring and find out what's happening to the tree this year. And then one of the other keys with diagnosis is that there's all sorts of different things. We're looking often at symptoms, and symptoms are how the plant responds to a problem. They're often not the problem itself. And so you have to figure out, what could be going on. So for example, with these grape leaves here, these are times when the symptoms are very, very distinctive. So if you were going to look at a grape leaf and you heard the word white on a grape leaf, I mean, one of the first things you'd probably think about is grape powdery mildew, because that's a disease that's really common with grapes. But you can see here that these is not the typical powdery mildew on the upper surface of the leaf. This is something totally different. And if we had a hand lens and could look at this very closely, you would find out that those white patches on the left side of the picture are all enlarged leaf hairs that are very, very big relative to normal and are stark white as opposed to being clear. So that is the symptom to whatever is causing the problem. And it turns out that this particular problem is called grape mite. So there's a tiny little areophyid mite that when it feeds on the leaf, the saliva has some toxins in it, and the leaves, grow this way. And then the little tiny mite lives in that leaf hair area and is pretty much protected from all sorts of predators and stuff like that. Doesn't make a lot of damage. So most of us if we have some grapes in our yard, probably won't do much about it. But as you can imagine, if you were going to try to, get rid of the little areophyid mites during the season, would not be the time you'd want to do it, because they're so protected by where they're feeding and by those felty patches on the underside of the leaf. The grape leaf on the right has pretty significant leaf shape distortion, some twisting and curling, and that is classic for growth regulating chemical injury. And this is probably the herbicide 2,4-D that's found in a lot of your weed and feeds and other types of products. Grapes are kind of the canaries in the mine for this. They're very, very sensitive. So in fact, our state has a variety of rules that talk about the types of herbicides that could be used in certain areas to keep the drift from happening so that the grape plants don't pick it up. Unfortunately, for a lot of you guys, you're growing in urban areas, and so you may be doing everything right to avoid drift in your garden or orchard. But if the neighbors, start to, weed and feed on a nice, muggy, windy day, you might get the product across the, drifting from that. So I use these examples because there's lots of times where people will think it's something else. And, you have to kind of like, for example, the grape mite, the first couple of times I saw it, people were worried about a disease called downy mildew of grape, which is not known to be in the state of Washington. And so I would, the first couple samples I would get when they were saying, I'm sending you some grape downy mildew, I'd be like, oh, no, this is not going to be good if it turns out to be grape downy mildew, because, we don't have it in the state. And I would hate to have to say, call up the Department of Ag and tell them, oh, guess what, we have another problem to deal with. But after seeing it once or twice, then I knew that, okay, that was probably not going to be the cause of the problem, and to look at the areophyid mite problem instead. And then the key feature that when I'm talking with growers and when I'm talking with orchardists and home gardeners and stuff like that, one of the key features that I feel we don't do a great job of talking about is the idea of the disease triangle. So in order to have a plant disease, you need 3 interacting features. You need the plant disease to be present. It needs to be in close association with a susceptible host plant. And then at the point where they are in, the pathogen and the host are interacting, the environment must be conducive for the establishment of the disease. So if you only have 2 of those factors, you don't have a disease. So for example, back to our fire blight example, we don't really know that the pathogens are present in Western Washington. So that's probably why we don't have the disease. We also don't have the really warm spring environment that the pathogen needs. So the conducive environment might be another reason. So an example here in this picture is a brown rot, and you can probably make out some of the fuzzy brown fungus growing all over that dead blossom. Now this isn't a tree fruit, this is my flowering quince, but every year it does some absolutely glorious symptoms of brown rot. And what we've got going on here again is going to be a susceptible plant, member of the rose family. So things like the flowering quince, cherry, plums, those kind of plants will get it. You have a, brown rot pathogen that can overwinter under cankers in the bark, on fruit that's fallen. It's got a lot of places to stay. And then moist but coolish conditions are what makes it thrive. So we have an incredible amount of this disease sometimes on plants, and my flowering quince is no different, because it's a very, very aggressive grower, and it's all packed in there. And so, every year I swear I'm going to have to cut it all the way down and start to thin it out just to try to keep the brown rot down. But the other nice thing about this is that, 1, I don't care because of course we're not preceding fruit on this plant. But 2, as it dries out and heats up in the summer, the brown rot organism, at least on flowers and blossoms, basically goes quiescent and stops being that active as a pathogen. Now, if you were growing susceptible, peaches or apricots or something like that, you might have to still do some management even as the season is heating up and drying out. And so the other part that's probably even more important to you guys is that this is how you pull out your toolbox for your management options. So you want to be influencing those circles and trying to, tease them all apart so that you don't end up with a big amount of disease. So if you're going to go plant another tree, and you might want to go look to see, if there's a rootstock that helps resist a problem, or if there's a variety that's, good against a certain disease. If you start to see damage on a plant that's a disease, pruning it out right there, you'd be removing some of the pathogen from the system. Pruning for good air circulation, siting the plant where it needs to be, making sure that the plant is getting enough fertilization, but not too much, is all things that you could be doing to the environment to make sure that you have less problems than if you were stressing the plant out, or not giving the plant too much water and weakening it or something like that. So it would be lovely if we had, a dichotomous key where we could figure out every single problem, but that would be, I don't know how fat that would be, but probably, tomes and tomes and tomes of information. And, the other thing is very, very situational. So I tend to investigate in a couple ways. First of all, when I'm doing a problem diagnosis, after 22 years, a lot of times, I'm just like, oh yeah, I've seen that, think that, do that. And yet I have to often sit back and remind myself that, even though you've seen 10,000 some disease problems, there's still new stuff out there. So looking carefully, asking a lot of questions, and trying to figure that out. So, so the first question I always ask, is there truly a problem? A lot of times, there's things that happen to the tree that are not problems. So, sorry, when my son is trying to drive me nuts here, let me just take this call very quickly. Hey, Marcus, I'm busy. Sorry, I can't help you. I'm busy. I can't help you. I'm teaching a class. Bye. Awesome. Thank you. So is there truly a problem? Do you know what the plant is? Do you know how it's supposed to be growing? Do you know where it's the location? If you think the answer is yes, there is a problem, then the first question I ask is where? Are we looking at a stem problem? Are we looking at a leaf problem? Are we looking at a trunk problem? Are we looking at a root problem? And that's going to be really helpful because that will give you some ideas of what problem might be. And unfortunately, many times your first thing you're going to see is a bunch of blighted leaves. They're necrotic or dead. And you might think, okay, it's a leaf problem because the leaves are dead. Well, no, the leaves could be dead because something's attacking at the leaf, but more likely, especially if it's all over the canopy of the plant, it's attacking the stems or the trunk or the roots. And then the plant is expressing problems in the leaf. So that's the first, is there a problem? Where do I think the problem is attacking the plant? And then the next big question I try to ask is, does this seem like something that has a living origin or a non-living origin? Is it something that's an insect, a disease, or is it something that's a stress to the plant? And there's definitely, lots of different things that you can look for in terms of the symptoms. I'll give you a chart of various things, but in general, the stresses, these are things like nutrition, weather, drought, wounding from, equipment or prunings, mispruning or something like that. In general, those things happen pretty quickly. They happen in a fairly uniform pattern. And then many of the stresses will similarly impact a wide variety of plants that aren't related by anything other than they're kind of in the same location. So those are the key features we're looking for there. Whereas the living problems, such as the insects, mites, or the pathogens, a lot of times that will show up gradually, be distributed at random, get worse over time, and or I just had brain freeze. And so those are some features that you're going to be looking for. And so that's the first thing I look for, is the pattern of the problem on the plant. And then I also go to look to see, do I see any spider mites? Do I see any fungal sporulation? Do I see any evidence of bacterial oozing? And some of that's easy. A lot of it requires, patience, a microscope, sometimes culturing on agar. So a lot of times I tell people, you do your best, and especially many of our options in the orchard and garden are, it doesn't really matter if it's a fungus or a bacteria, because you're going to be doing, things to dry out the plant whenever you can. You're going to be doing things to prune out the wounded tissue. You're going to be, if you use some sort of product, they're pretty generalist products, like maybe they're a copper and they're going to take out a variety of different pathogen types, or at least prevent them from getting inside the plant. So sometimes it's you can stay right there. Other times it's important to figure it out. And that's when I say, okay, definitely, send me a picture, send me a physical sample, and I will do my best to help you out. So lots of different ways to look at a plant problem. And many times, you end up with, okay, I think I can rule out this, but I can't really tell what that is, or I think that might be. So a lot of times you have to ask even more questions, or go back and look at a different part of the plant or something. So definitely the people that, there's people that think that they send a sample to the lab and they're going to get, an answer that every single time just doesn't happen. So, if you've got a lot of mysteries in your backyard, orchard, or something like that, believe me, I have a lot of mysteries that come into the lab as well. So the picture here is a blueberry, and it has that kind of bronzing to the foliage. And there's a very good chance that that is going to be some sort of viral infection, but it also could be nutritional. So we'd have to do some more work to try to figure out which is which. Probably go 3 now. Okay. Sure. Okay. There we go. So another thing that I am always telling people is that it's important not to make too many assumptions. you end up, when you're facing a problem, there's a lot of times where you might have a beautiful idea of what's going on. And if you ask a lot of questions about your theory, you might hear, no, that didn't happen, etc. And it's always important to take in the information, not to stay wedded to your diagnosis. So this particular cherry is probably an ornamental cherry. You can see it's in somebody's backyard, but I mean, it would be the same thing if you were growing a tree fruit cherry. Person came in, they saw holes, and what do you think they thought it was? Obviously, they thought it was bugs. And so, there's definitely some that you think, well, maybe there's a weevil there too, but the overall general picture of this is not really what I would consider insect-like. And so I was a little concerned about some of the, curling and distortion in addition to the holes, kind of a paler color in places. And so, when I ask for samples, especially I like to start with pictures first for diagnosis, because that can give you an idea of whether what part of the plant you want to see in the lab, or, maybe sometimes you can even get the answer from that. And I love to see 3 types of pictures. I like to see the close-up of what your concern is. I love to see the landscape shot of the plant in the garden or the orchard. And then I also, especially with trees, like to see the look of the trunk at the soil line, because that can tell you a lot about root issues. So this particular one, I noticed that in the background of the picture on the right, that lawn looked so green. So I called the woman up and I said, well, you sent it in because you want to know what was eating the leaves. And I don't think anything's eating it. I have some questions about your weed management practices. I'm curious if there's a connection to herbicides causing these symptoms. And she said, I am an organic gardener. And then she laughed and said, but my daughter's getting married in the backyard in 3 weeks, and proceeded to tell me all the, various herbicides she had used to clean up weeds. And so I said, well, the nice thing about this picture is it also shows me that there's some regrowth of returning to normal. So your tree picked up some herbicides when you applied it over the root system, showed the symptoms, and now it's probably worked its way through and it's going to grow just fine. And so we did agree that, that was probably what was going on. And she had a good laugh about that. A couple years later, somebody called me about their beloved apple tree that their daughter was supposed to get married in front of. And of course, it had just headed south so fast, dead as a doornail. She was very upset. She wanted some diagnosis. And I said, well, yeah, I can help you figure out what went wrong. Not going to make it look better in 2 days. And she was fretting about that. And I said, well, just remember, people are coming not to look at your garden, but to enjoy the wedding. And so not to worry about the fact that there's this blighted tree in the background. Nobody else but her was going to notice it. Here's a plant problem called, the tree in the picture is a hazelnut. And you can see on the branch that has the orange cording, lots of lichens, and that's what the person had thought was or moss and lichens and stuff like that. That person was concerned about that. And I said, no, those are not a problem. Those are just living on the plant. But what I see the problem is all those little, black dots along that stem. Those black dots are fungi, and that fungus is going to be Eastern filbert blight. Most likely. We could, look it up under the microscope and prove that point. And so this was a case where, they were not, it was too bad because there's no real cures for this problem, but they weren't too happy with the diagnosis because they had first thought it was, the moss and other stuff. And then when I initially said, no, that can't be, they decided the neighbors had sprayed it or something. And I said, no, probably not that either. I think it's just a fungal disease that's spreading in our community. So in this case, the management would be find a resistant variety. Oregon State produced quite a few different cultivars that are fairly resistant to Eastern filbert blight. Although some of them will get the disease, but they then, wound over and don't have a lot of problems with it. The other thing about Eastern filbert blight is that, if you stay on top of it, you give your plants really good vigor, you can stay ahead of the disease for large, long periods of time. In fact, when this disease first hit Oregon's industry, yields went up initially because people had been basically, leaving the trees to do whatever they wanted. And when they started thinning them out, pruning things out, getting more light circulation, better water management, and stuff like that, the crop yield went up. There are lots of wonderful resources out there, and whenever possible, I'm like, let's use some local ones. That being said, if you've never read the Ohio State University fact sheet, 20 questions on plant problem diagnosis, definitely that link there would be helpful. And before this talk started, I was trying to link my notes to this talk, but because we're not on a WSU Zoom link, I couldn't figure out how to do it. So I did send the copy to Deb, and maybe she can include it with your minutes or something like that. For those of you that haven't seen the Plant Disease Management Handbook online, it's available as a website. Many of you probably have the old copy of it somewhere, but it hasn't even been printed the last couple of years, just been on a website. And in some ways that's, too bad, because it was always fun to leaf through it and learn. But in other ways, it's kind of much easier now that it's a website. You can quickly, search online and figure out, very specifically what you're looking for. There's a disease handbook and an insect handbook. And then for a lot of your home orchard needs, the WSU HortSense website, that's the URL there, would be a great resource for management of pests and diseases. I had said we'd talk a little bit about symptoms and signs. So again, the word symptom, which I've highlighted the P there on the left, that's my key, is that P stands for plant tissue. So it's whatever the plant is doing, and there's all sorts of different symptoms. The plant is dying or is necrotic. The plant is yellow or chlorotic. The plant is wilting. The plant is distorted. The plant has a gall. There's all those sorts of different things. And so the plant symptoms are the kind of the distress call, the I'm having an issue kind of thing. And they are more general. So there will be times when there's only one or two things that causes that symptom. But a lot of times when you look at a symptom like a yellow leaf or a dying, leaf spot or something like that, it could be everything. It could be stress, it could be disease, it could be pest, and you have to figure it out. The sign is the organism that's doing the damage. So the easiest thing to think about with signs is like aphids and spider mites, where pretty much we can all see those with the unaided eye. But there's a lot of pathogens where you can see the sign too. So here is my test subject, the flowering quince, with at least one fruit on it, and you can see how most of the fruit is covered by a gymnosporangium rust infection, so pustules of rust. And, fortunately, I wasn't going to turn that into jelly or anything like that, so it didn't really matter to me. But there are some other closely related rust, like pear trellis rust and stuff like that, that can cause problems on fruiting plants. So this particular chart has to do with symptoms and signs and their distribution, trying to help you decide whether something is a non-living stress, or also known as abiotic, or a biotic disease or pest issue. And so with signs, the organism doing the damage. With a stress, there's not going to be anything that actually did it. That's the weather, that's the drought, that's the June heat dome, those kind of things. With biotic diseases, there may be signs, but they may not be visible to the unaided eye. They may not be at a time when you're looking at them. So you may or may not see them. And the same thing for insects and mites. You could see an aphid, but if it has flown off, you're not going to see it. You may also with aphids and mites see something they leave behind, like fecal material such as frass, honeydew drip, those kind of things. And then if we go to distribution of symptoms and onset of symptoms, there's going to be distinct differences there, where stresses often show up very uniformly all over a plant, or sometimes strongly one-sided, such as the south side of the plant or the side of the yard that gets the cold winds in winter, or the area of your yard where the sprinkler system failed on you. So, everything in there is having some problems with water. Diseases and pests often show up at random. And many, many times, stresses show up a lot faster than pests or diseases, because whatever happened to the plant, the injury occurred, and you see it really quickly. So, drought stress or heat damage can happen, over the course of a day or even shorter. Whereas with diseases and mites, not diseases, diseases and insects and mites, usually you don't see the first, 5 leaf spots or the first 10 aphids or something. It takes some time and builds up over time. And then, because with diseases and insects and mites, there's something reproducing, the problem usually spreads with time. And then a lot of times, with those, you also have like host ranges, where the host ranges are pretty close to each other, or like all members of the rose family, or all members of the citrus family, or something like that. Unfortunately, there's a column that I always leave off, and that is the don't know, haven't a clue, what I've never thought about this before column, because a lot of times people just haven't thought to think about these things, or you haven't thought to think about it in your own orchard. And then unfortunately, there's also a bunch of times when the exception proves the rule. So for example, many a time where very rapid onset of a problem might be a disease that spreads really quickly, or a very uniform injury on a plant might be, instead of a stress, might be a disease, because there's just so much succulent green tissue and the environment's right for that disease to happen. So I would love it if this chart worked every single time, but it doesn't. But usually if you think about some of these things, it'll help you make that decision, living versus not. And then I'm going to skip this one. Oh, actually, I'm going to say one thing about this. There are differences between fungi and bacteria, but I am a firm believer that almost all of us in this crowd, as well as your general Joe homeowners, really don't need to know this information, because the things that we're going to be doing for fungal infections and bacterial infections are almost the same. We're going to be pruning for good air circulation. We're going to be trying to keep the water down at the roots of the plant instead of up in the canopy, for long periods of time. We're going to be, if our toolboxes include pesticides, most of the pesticides we use on fruit trees and small fruit are pretty generalist. So they're things like coppers, and they work for both fungi and for bacteria. So you don't, in order to get to a management, I don't think you need to know it. But if you were really curious, fungi tend to be round, they tend to be over veins, whereas the bacteria tend to be angular, limited by veins. And I would say for the, in the 22 years that I've done this, maybe 3 or 4 of the samples out of probably 100 each summer actually do what they're supposed to do and follow these patterns. So I just wanted to give a couple examples of some of the things that I've seen this year. And so this was a early sample that came in this spring, and the person was really upset about their fruiting quince, because they had, this, you can see the canopy there is all brown and blighted out, and they had quite a problem with low fruit production in that year or the year previous or something like that. Well, it was a very interesting sample because it had this disease called Fabrea leaf spot all over it. And this Fabrea leaf spot is prevalent in Western Washington, but it's kind of interesting because I see it on quince and I see it on Asian pear. I don't see it on European pear. And so, and then the other interesting thing about the quince sample was it was sporulating all over the leaves. I don't think there was any fruit in the sample because that was one of their concerns. And so, but the interesting thing about Asian pear that gets this is that you almost never, you might see a few leaf spots, but you usually don't see the sporulation until you get to the fruit stage. So I just thought it was pretty amazing that, one pathogen on two different hosts performs so differently, from a diagnostic standpoint. So my guess is that what's going on here with this quince was, one, it was pretty pretty pathetic year this spring with all that cold and wet conditions. Second of all, the Fabrea leaf spot obviously took out a lot of the leaves, so the tree doesn't have the resources that it might need. I don't really know if there's a connection to the Fabrea leaf spot caused the blossoms to blight out or not. We'll probably be checking on that this year, trying to figure out if that's the connection there.
Jenny,
Uh-huh.
this is Deb. This is Deb Jaquith.
Uh-huh.
That was me. That was mine.
That was yours. Okay. Well, how fantastic. Did I get the story correct then?
Close enough. Yeah. Thank you.
Excellent. Excellent. Well, and Deb, thank you for saying that, because usually when I bring samples to places in groups, I'm always like, I collected all this in my own yard or at work. So, don't feel bad about that. Well, and then Deb also had sent in her pears, and I can't really remember all the things, but there were some holes, but that wasn't really the problem. The issue was it had Fabrea leaf spot on it as well. And so that told me that even though she didn't know what kind of pear it was, it's probably an Asian pear of some sort, just because I just don't see this particular problem on European pear around here. And yet, if you read in the literature for books that, are nationwide, it obviously can get on a lot of our European pears, but for whatever reason, we just don't have the environment here for that.
And it's a regular kind of pear. It's not Asian.
Okay.
But I don't know what kind it is.
Yeah. So, and again, I've been doing this 20 some years. I don't know it all. So yeah. And then a couple other things we've seen this year. So here's a cherry tree, probably just a pie cherry. It's out in the woods, so I don't think it's anything, super cultivarish. But one of the things that we get a lot of questions about is plants that have kind of light yellow leaves all over them, and mosaic effect. And so this is a viral infection. And this particular virus is probably spread by areophyid mites. So when the leaves were looked at under the microscope, we could see these really tiny little mites. And so the key feature is, what do you do about it? Well, in this case, nobody's going to do anything with this one because it's just out in the woods. But if this was in your orchard, what would you do? So there are no cures for virus infections. What you end up needing to do, the only way you can get rid of them is to remove the plant. In tree fruit production, what they do is, if that was a cultivar that they needed to save, they would go take the meristem, the growing tip, they would heat it up, and hopefully denature the proteins in the virus, basically kill off a virus. Not that viruses are alive, so you really can't kill something that wasn't alive to begin with, but they would change the virus in a way that it couldn't reproduce, or it couldn't use the plant to reproduce. And hopefully, even though with heat, they wouldn't kill the plant itself, they tissue culture it out now or grow it up, somehow. And then they would test to make sure that they had succeeded in removing the virus without killing the plant. So when you go to the garden store to buy your new your new plant, you fork over $5 or $6 extra bucks, and you're doing, great things for that. So unfortunately, viruses do spread in a lot of different ways, and every virus is a little different. So a lot of them do spread by insects or mites. There are other ones that spread by pollen. There are other ones that spread by mechanical, like pruning, those kind of things. So when I'm telling people about plant diseases that are viruses in their tree fruit, my first thing is, it'd be lovely if we could figure out exactly what virus it is, but that often is quite costly. And the other thing about virus testing is it's kind of a needle in the haystack thing. Like, you think it's going to be, you've got 40 viruses to pick from, and if you can only test one at a time, or maybe a family at a time. And so you just kind of work your way through it. But what you try to do is figure out, okay, what could the virus be? Is there any way I could prove it? And if you can, yeah, awesome. If not, you're just like, okay, these are some ideas. And then of those possibilities, how does it spread? How impactful is it to the plant? So there are, times when a virologist would tell you, remove them all. Practical Jenny would say, well, this one doesn't, hurt the plant too much. It doesn't spread by, insects or something like that. So you can kind of keep it. So there's a lot of things that you have to think about when you're making that decision, live or let live, or, remove it. And what I've been finding recently, now that we have all this molecular testing, is that, almost every plant has something you never expected to find in it. So, a complete disease-free tree is, especially after it's been in your garden for a while, is nearly impossible to find. So I probably would, decide whether or not this is an issue. There are viruses where, yes, you must get rid of them. So like in the central Washington area, there's what is it? Little cherry virus. That's a really big problem, and they're having to remove, big parts of orchards in order to get rid of the pathogen. And then we saw this spring, it was an incredible year, spring and summer, for powdery mildews of all kinds. And I saw a lot of pear powdery mildew, and quite a few occasions, and you might see this in your orchard, where you have some powdery mildew in your pear, and then instead of being white, it's kind of a gray, ugly kind of color. And that's a really cool thing, in that there is another fungus that's a parasite of powdery mildews. So it's growing on top of the powdery mildew, trying to kill it off. I don't think you can there's some products that are being used for biological control, but the main issue with that, the issue is that you already have to have the powdery mildew in order to have the hypoparasite there. So you're never going to use it to, totally eradicate powdery mildew. On pear and apple, powdery mildew often gets in really early in the season, and it actually can, distort the shape of the leaves. I mean, they almost look like they've been hit with a herbicide. It's pretty amazing. And then the other key feature for all you that have a variety of trees and also garden plants is that powdery mildews are extremely host specific. So the one that's on the pear, it could possibly be the same one on apple, but it might be a little bit different. It's definitely not the same powdery mildew that's on a squash plant in your garden. It's definitely not the same powdery mildew that's on your lawn grass or on your lilac. I mean, we have 200 and some different powdery mildews. A couple summers ago, I had a PhD student from Prosser she finished up, and her project was on the powdery mildew of choke cherry. And she discovered that the powdery mildew that was found on choke cherry was completely different than the powdery mildew that was being found on cherry rootstock in the production nurseries. I mean, they were like, 10 feet away from each other, and yet they weren't the same organism. So while everybody had been saying, oh, cherry, it's a problem, she was able to prove that the organisms were totally different. But why did she have two totally different organisms? Well, because remember back to that disease triangle. You had two different hosts, two different pathogens, and then the key feature was moisture that the powdery mildew likes to thrive, the humidity. I'm going to skip that one for now. I think I'll skip that one too. And then rust, I'm almost wrapping up here, so I'm going to ask you this question, but we can answer it at the end of the talk. But we get a lot of samples in with rust on pear. And the key features that I wanted to remind people of tonight is that the pear rust is not going from pear to pear to pear to pear. What it is doing is it's on a pear, then it goes to a conifer host like a juniper. It produces a spore that can go back to pear. So you don't have to worry necessarily about spreading. Unfortunately, it's really hard to bring the two hosts far enough apart so the disease can't keep going. But what I was curious about is we have that one called pear trellis rust that has a really disgusting looking gall on the other side of the leaf. And I keep getting lots of people that are removing trees from it. And I'm not really sure whether they're removing the tree just because they don't like the look of it on the leaves, or if it's really impacting the fruit production as well. So I'll be curious if you can comment on that when we're done with this talk. Skip that for right now. And then, you know, like I said, I've said this a couple times, but many times, you know, something you see in one place isn't going to tell you the answer because you need to look somewhere else. So like the first couple of fire blight samples that I was dealing with from the central Washington area, I mean, I couldn't just say, oh, can't be fire blight because you don't have that pathogen there. I had to be like, okay, it could be. And I was, you know, pretty stressed out because it's a high value crop and it's kind of a hard one to culture from really woody tissue and stuff like that. And I fortunately had said to him, I said, you know, there are other things that could look like this. So make sure you know, send in a root stock and something like that. And it turned out that yes, indeed, what they were concerned was fire blight was in fact a root rot, like phytophthora root rot down in the root system. And since the roots weren't functioning, you know, the top was dying back. And so that was a nice way to figure this out. I also then had to, you know, evaluate it for fire blight since I was in that area, but it didn't turn out to be the problem. And then, you know, there's lots of times with diagnosis, you need a whole bunch of stuff. And I'm a firm believer of, you know, if you're gonna get it, learn how to use it. So, you know, find your favorite resources, whether they're online or a book, and, you know, delve into them when you're not needing it right there. I'm a firm believer of, you know, if you're going out to the garden looking for problems, you need to have a way to cut a sample. You need to have a you know, way to capture some images, because far too often, if you see something, when you come back in 3 weeks, it won't remember where it is, and, you know, stuff like that. So there's a lot of stuff you could use with diagnosis. And then unfortunately, you know, all of our IPM toolboxes don't contain time machines. So when people, you know, call me up and they want a solution, I mean, part of my job is just to be realistic. We're never, you know, going to go back to before apple maggot or go back to before brown marmorated stink bug. There's a lot of stuff that the window opened, it got in, and now we're having to live with it. Our contact information is there. And like I said, I sent the handout to Deb. And then I just wanted to thank you for your time. And then definitely let's have some Q&A right here. So I'll stop screen sharing. And if I can get this, somebody can, let's see here. Where get you guys off the screen. And then,
Thank you, Jenny. Wow. Really interesting.
Okay, so I covered a ton of stuff. I know some of it was old hat. What can I answer for you? And feel free to put it in the chat too, if that's easier for you. Or did I just overwhelm you and we just need to go to bed now? Have a piece of apple pie and go to bed. Yeah. Okay, so Ruth says she has Pacific trellis rust and doesn't seem a problem. That's what I think. I think a lot of people are making a decision to cut a tree down when it doesn't really need to be cut down. But I do know that some of those galls are absolutely revolting looking. So, and
I was wondering about, we have black aphids on our cherries. Is that a pest in itself, or is it a water problem? Do you know?
Well, there's a variety of aphids that get on cherries. Black cherry aphid is one of them, and it's black cherry aphid is often will do a lot of honeydew drip and stuff like that. So many times people get the idea that pests attack trees that are weakened or something like that. But there's a whole host of pests that love super vibrant green tissue, and aphids are one of those. You know, they're piercing into leaves, they're sucking up cell contents. So a lot of times when you look at the management options for aphids, you will see that it says like balance your fertility. You know, you don't want super lush tissue. Another group of pathogens that will in addition to the pest aphids, but also the rust infections and the powdery mildews, they really like succulent tissue. So, yes, indeed, many times if a plant is stressed, and I probably should have mentioned that back on the whole what does what, but a lot of times you just don't have one problem. You have a stress, and then an insect will come in or a disease will come in. But yes, the converse is true. Many times you will have a super thriving plant and something will take advantage of that. So, I wouldn't say back off on the water because the plant might need it, but you might have to look to see, is that, what is the water needs of that plant? What is the fertilizer needs? And can I alter them in some way to discourage the aphids without hurting the plant? A lot of times you can just leave them alone because, the plant is going to, what was I gonna say? Plant is going to not need all the green tissue it makes. And so if, again, if it's something that isn't damaging the fruit, it might not be worth your management. And then a lot of times ants will, tend aphids and stuff like that. So, maybe that might be something that's going on there too. Deb, you had your hand up?
Yeah, thank you. You had diagnosed a plum that I have with leaf curl aphids. What's the is that a particular type of aphid that
Right. So leaf curl plum aphid is a type of aphid, has a host range of plum, probably a few, closely related plants. And then what it does that's so different than a lot of the other things is that in its saliva, there is a toxin and the leaf curls. So you can almost see more symptoms. So when you see that curled leaf, you're just itching to look inside, and a lot of times you'll uncurl it and you will find an insect in there. And so, yeah, that would be leaf curl plum aphid.
Best treatment for it?
Best treatment would be to go look at the PNW handbook and Hort Sense and make sure that everything I say is, accurate. But a lot of times with aphids, it's a case of removing the aphid before it gets to that stage. So delayed dormant oils, if the aphid is on the overwintering as eggs on the stems and stuff like that. And I can't truthfully remember right now what it is. Like, for example, I know, like with woolly apple aphid, you don't use a delayed dormant because the woolly aphid is down in the roots during the winter, not on the branches. But yeah, a lot of them will be overwintering on branches and stuff, and that would be a great way to take care of it. Again, with aphids, they love succulent green tissue, so make sure you're not over fertilizing. And then there's a whole bunch of predators that you can encourage, and then there are a ton of different insecticides. So does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. Yeah, and about I'm someone who likes to leave the leaves on the ground when they fall, because for several different reasons. One of them is that in their process of decomposing, they attract all kinds of other insects and organisms that the birds eat. They just add to I think a healthy environment. However, there are some diseases that, boy, you don't want to leave your leaves down on the ground. You want to work on sanitation and pick up all the dead fruit pick up all the fruit and leaves. So I don't know if you want to comment on that at all.
Yeah, that's a great point, Deb, because the truth is sanitation is very helpful, but the other thing is that we are often living in pretty tight urban environments, and so you could be doing you could be really working hard on sanitation, and if your neighbor is not doing anything, the windblown spore is going to just come in over the fence, and so all that hard work is for nothing. So I have to say that I'm definitely a live and let live type of gardener. So if the thing doesn't do it for me, well, it's out of there kind of feeling. but there are very, very few diseases and pests that I am too concerned about, leaving in the environment, simply because the likelihood that you're going to actually do anything about it practically, with as common as that problem is just ridiculous. Like, for example, there's we get apple scab in from homeowners all the time. I mean, I know apple scab, I can diagnose it probably while I'm sleeping, and yet I can't help myself, but every single time I have to go under the scope and take a look at it, because first of all, the spores are absolutely adorable. They look like little footprints. They're just so cute. And then second of all, in a little tiny section, maybe a half an inch across, there's 50,000 of them. And I'm just thinking, oh yeah, we think we're going to, we think when one can cause a disease, we're going to get ahead of this by sanitation. Yeah. And then there's a lot of times where the problem that you're looking at, also overwinters on the plant itself. And so, even though there's some of the pathogen in the fallen leaves, I mean, the stems are a lot closer to the new growth than the leaves are. So, I mean, hard to say where it's coming from. So, yeah. So I am certainly, if something is brand new to an area, yeah, let's get rid of it. Let's take care of it. Let's not try to let it spread. But a lot of our endemic stuff, the stuff that we've been dealing with for years, you really aren't going to make that big of a difference through sanitation and stuff like that. That being said, it doesn't mean don't do something, because there's a lot of times where like for example, with both fire blight on the central Washington and bacterial blight here on our side of the state, if you got in there when your pear is starting to blight back and pruned it all out, that would be wonderful, because not only is the pathogen, going to spread less in the plant itself, but those pathogens can make toxins that cause, widespread damage in the plant. And so you could reduce that. So Randy had a question. He said, he said, blueberry plants, notice some black beetles that might be blueberry flea beetle. Plant seems healthy. There doesn't seem to be a whole large number of beetles. Is it something to keep an eye on, or yeah, definitely want to keep an eye on it. I'm a firm believer, if you have a picture of it, feel free to email it to me, Jenny R. Glass. No, that's my home number. Jenny Glass at WSU.edu. We can maybe get an identification. But yeah, there is lots of stuff out there that isn't worth, isn't going to be a problem. And then unfortunately with blueberries, I get in lots and lots of blueberries that have all sorts of problems. And I would say my diagnostic batting average for blueberries is pathetic. I mean, it's probably 10%. Occasionally you'll see a phomopsis, occasionally you'll see Gadronia canker, occasionally like, oh, it's a virus infection. And then the rest of them, I look for this and I look for that, and I am not sure. And I do know a couple, blueberry growers down south who just believe that things like, one of them hates drapers for some reason, and he just thinks that the plant has it out for him or something like that, which we know doesn't happen. But, so whether off the top of my head, I can't think of what it might be, but if I had a picture, I could probably help you out. And definitely, if you hadn't seen it before, keep your eye out for it, and let's figure it out next year if it shows back up.
Hey, sounds good. Thank you.
Yeah. Any other questions?
I have 2 citrus trees. One's a lemon, the other's a lime. They've had the same treatment. They've had the same change of potting with the same soil. One's doing fine, and the other one turned yellow and lost all its leaves.
Okay. Don't get a lot of citrus into the plant clinic. Have you had them a long time?
3-4 years. It's just they've had the same treatment at the same time. And one is, well, it would do better if the cat stopped chewing on it, but the other one, I don't know, it's just not doing.
Yeah, well, I mean, they are definitely, both citrus, but lemons and limes are different. So, maybe there's something about it with, if the leaves are yellow, I mean, I would look into root health, I would look into nutrition, I would look into environment. But yeah, it could be a whole bunch of stuff. And the one thing usually I don't tend to worry about when it's, 1 or 2 interior plants is usually you're not going to get some massively exotic disease, because, disease have to come from somewhere. And if it's not, if there's nothing to spread it to, if you were blessed with buying a healthy plant, where would it come from? The other thing, though, a lot of the citrus plants will get your common indoor pests. So, mealybugs, aphids, scale insects. So, definitely do look out for like scale insects and stuff. Although usually if you don't see the scale insects, you see the honeydew drip, they leave behind or something like that. But yeah.
They've both been treated exactly the same, and one's okay and the other's not. Just weird.
Yep. And I have to say, after 22 years of doing diagnosis, I wish I could go back to the first couple of years where I was learning a lot, but I didn't realize how much I didn't know. Because it's almost harder now when you've, instead of the 3 or 4 situations you've heard of, going through the 20 something that you've heard of. So yeah. And one thing that I've never been able to also do is, you love to be able to say, hey, lemon, hey, lime, what the heck is going on? And yet still have never been able to figure out how to get them to talk back to you. So.
Well, they haven't. I have asked.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah, I wonder what's, that's a pretty common diagnosis that I have to give from time to time. Not very satisfying, but.
Thank you, Heather, for the question. Anybody else? Here's your chance. Here's your chance. Let's see.
So what kind of problems did you have this year? I mean, I've heard people say it wasn't a good year for apples, and that would,
I know my apples were fine, other than the fact that they were riddled with insect damage because I haven't protected them the way I should.
There's no shoulds. I mean, everybody has to garden the way and grow the way they want to. So, and like, for example, I mean, there's a big issue with like,
I see.
As awful as it is to say, removing apple trees if you're not going to be dealing with apple maggot, and that's a big push. But the big push is in central Washington, where we get most of our production. I mean, out here, the 15 of us or 20 of us on the line, if we either totally managed or got rid of the tree if we didn't want to, that's great. But it's not going to take, account for all the untended trees everywhere else. So, it's one of those things where you don't have to feel, you don't have to feel too guilty about that. You're not overly adding to the pest population of the environment because of just how bad that problem is.
Yeah, I took out a whole section, a huge section of junipers, because I believe that they were infected with
rust,
the pear trellis. Yeah. Yep. And if I was on my own computer, I could show you beautiful pictures of the fungus on the junipers. It's really interesting. It starts out orange on the stems, and then if it rains, then you get these globby things hanging down. And I still wonder if they're if that affected the quince and the pears there, but I think it may take another season to see what happens there.
I mean, we see a lot of the incense cedar with the rust on it, and that starts out as a kind of a regular rusty sort of thing, and then it becomes jelly-like. We have a juniper on campus where I know it has a rust infection, but most of the year you can't see it. Very rarely when I walk by it, oh yeah, there's a little one or two things. The pathogens can spread mile or two in the wind, so the likelihood that just removing that one is going to do any good is, again, pretty slim. Rachel says she's putting up a good fight against blueberry mummyberry. Excellent. You might want to look at the literature that was coming out of Mount Vernon recently because they've really found out some things that we thought about mummyberry weren't exactly true. And I'd love to tell you exactly what the specifics are, but I don't really remember them. So, you know, if you go online, Google, type in, you know, WSU Mount Vernon mummyberry and see what comes up. Ruth says she had some fruit drop on medlar and persimmons and was wondering, you know, some of it dropped in August, even though it looked good prior to that, what could be the problem? And yeah, I wish I could tell you. There is, you know, fruit drop is one of those ones where the laundry list is so huge that it's really hard to tell what the heck is going on. And then somebody else about weed torches help prevent or eliminate problems or do more harm than good. For using a weed torch as a, you know, to prevent weeds probably is fine, especially if your orchard's fine. Where we get the problem is when people like try to weed around a very dry arborvitae hedge with flame. That's not a good thing because they burn the trees down. Does it do more harm than good? I don't exactly know, Reed, what you're trying to get at there. So maybe if you unmute yourself, you could, or if not, just send me an email and we'll be happy to try to answer that later. So
I don't see Reed. Oh, yes. Yeah, Reed's here still.
yeah, but yeah, I mean, and the main, you know, and then for example, like, I mean, one of the issues that one of our former plant pathologists used to remove, cut out and then cauterize cankers for things like anthracnose or brown rot cankers and stuff like that. And he showed it because in his orchard in Ording that it was, you know, pretty effective at removing the disease problems. What he didn't ever tell his, you know, master gardeners or his orchardists or something is that by the time he was done, the tree looked so bad that, you know, he was a little embarrassed and he just cut them down anyway. And I quickly stopped recommending that because of, you know, after dealing with your Joe public and you realize how little of the accurate information they take in, I was always afraid that, you know, they'd be doing it places that didn't need to, or worse, they'd do it in a way that would, you know, end up in the hospital. And then the other thing that we haven't had for a couple of years, but you know, that where flames come up is when people get tent caterpillars or fall webworm. And I am a firm believer in live and let live on those babies because, you know, they can eat a lot. I mean, I still have memories of what was it, 2001, where, you know, you could hear them before you could see them. But plants have a lot of, you know, latent buds. They have the ability to put another flush of growth out. The pruning job, hack job you do to get rid of a nest is going to be worse for the plant, in my opinion, than just leaving them. If you must do something, you know, trying to open up the webbing to get the larva exposed, really important to help get birds in there so they can start eating them. And then most of these things are cyclic. So, you know, if the population builds up to a certain height, especially with things like the tent caterpillar, what will happen is, I mean, what we've just been going through the last couple of years, an epidemic of a disease, there'll be a virus disease that comes and, you know, kills them all off. So I am not a proponent of pruning and burning of, you know, caterpillar nests or things like that.
Interesting. Well, anybody else have questions? Questions for Jenny? Jenny, thank you. Thank you so much. I'm gonna.
Yes, well, I hope to see you guys in person here sooner or later. And yeah, okay. And somebody gave a person to talk to about citrus problems, right? Because down at University of California, they know a lot more about citrus than we do. I'm glad you thought it was helpful. So, and then, like I said, Jenny Glass at wsu.edu. Feel free to email me if you've got a question or want to send me a picture of a problem or something like that. And I hope that some of the things I talked to you about today will be helpful. So thank you all so much.
Thank you
Thank
very
you.
much. All righty. Well, yeah, thanks. Just very much, Jenny. Any other things for anyone want to share or ask about while we're here? Or is everybody ready to?
I have a question on the recording of this. Where will that be available for people to go and